Canadians are what are referred to as visa exempt, meaning they can enter the United States with simply their passport on most occasions. Even when they obtain an H-1B visa or a work visa in the United States, they don't need to go to a U.S. consulate for stamping to receive a visa prior to seeking entry to the United States. So ultimately, what are those benefits that Canadians have for being visa exempt? Well, first, you don't need a visa for short-term visits to the United States. You can come for up to 6 months for tourism or qualifying business visitor activities without the need of obtaining an actual B1, B2 visa stamp in your passport. You can simply present yourself at a U.S. port of entry, explain the reasons that you're coming to the United States, and if it qualifies as a visitor for tourism or business, then you will be admitted to the United States simply with your passport without the need of going to a U.S. consulate to obtain a B1 or B2 visa. Also, work visas are issued immediately at ports of entry for Canadian citizens. So if you are coming to the United States to work under TN status, you don't need to go to a U.S. consulate for pre-approval. You can present your documentation, your application at a port of entry and be adjudicated for and admitted in TN status right there on the spot without actually being issued a visa in your passport. The same thing applies to an H-1B visa or an L-1 visa. You do not need to go to a U.S. consulate to first obtain a visa in your passport before presenting yourself at a U.S. port of entry to enter under TN, H-1B, or L status. They will simply admit you at the port of entry with the proper documentation right there on the spot without having to first obtain a visa at a consulate. Another benefit for being a visa exempt Canadian is the J1 foreign residency rule exception for Canadians. And this applies especially to H-1B visas. Typically, you have to obtain a waiver of a 2-year foreign residency requirement, or you have to meet the 2-year foreign residency requirement in order to receive an H-1B visa. However, since Canadians are visa exempt and they do not need an actual visa in their passport, they can obtain an H-1B without the need of obtaining that waiver first. Also, Canadians coming to the United States on an F-1 visa to study don't need to go to a U.S. consulate to first receive that F-1 visa in their passport. They simply present their I-20s at a U.S. port of entry, and they are admitted in F-1 status to the United States. So being a visa-exempt Canadian has several advantages when it comes to U.S. immigration. Now, when does a Canadian need a visa? When does that visa-exempt status not apply to a Canadian? Well, the primary one is when you're immigrating to the United States. If you're coming to the United States to receive a green card, then you will have to go through the immigrant visa process, and you will have to be issued an immigrant visa at the U.S. consulate in Montreal prior to seeking entry to the United States for permanent residence or in order to obtain a green card. Also, there are certain work visas that do require you to have an interview at a U.S. consulate and to receive a visa in your passport. That applies to E1 treaty traders and E2 investors. They have to apply and then go to Toronto. That's where initial registrations for e-visas take place, and they will be actually issued a visa, an E1 or E2 visa in their passport for entry to the United States. And the final time that Canadians would require an actual visa in their passport is if they are going through the fiancé visa process, that K1 visa that is issued at the consulate in Montreal and requires that visa stamp prior to entry on a fiancé visa to the United States. So Canadians enjoy many benefits by being visa exempt to the United States. It makes it much easier for them to come to visit and work in the United States. But if you are immigrating to the United States or working in the United States on an E1 treaty trader or an E2 visa, then you are going to be required to obtain that visa first prior to entry to the United States.